The air in the precinct felt thick with tension as the chief stood before the investigative panel. His decision had been made, and now it was time to act. He cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. He laid out the findings for all to hear, every buried complaint, every instance of misconduct that had been covered up. The silence in the room was deafening as officers exchanged uneasy glances. The corrupt officers' smug demeanor crumbled. They had spent years feeling untouchable, shielded by a system that protected its own. But now, their shield was gone. The chief's words were a declaration that the old way of doing things was over. Accountability had arrived, and it wasn't leaving quietly. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers as news spread that the officers had been suspended pending criminal charges. Justice was finally within reach, and the people knew their voices had made a difference. The woman stood among them, a sense of relief washing over her. But she knew this victory was just one step forward. As the chief stepped outside to address the community, his mother caught his eye. No words were needed, just a nod that spoke of pride and resilience. He had kept his promise, not just to her, but to the community that deserved better. But just when it seemed like the story had reached its resolution, the final twist revealed itself. One of the senior officers, who had remained quiet throughout the investigation, stepped forward with a startling confession. The corruption went even deeper than anyone had suspected, involving powerful figures beyond the precinct walls. The fight for justice was far from over. The chief's resolve hardened. He knew this was only the beginning, but he was ready. He had the support of his mother, the community, and most importantly, his own unshakable belief in doing what was right. As the crowd dispersed, the woman looked at her son, knowing the road ahead would be challenging but hopeful. This wasn't just their fight anymore, it was a movement, and nothing was going to stop it now. As the dust began to settle, the chief knew the battle wasn't entirely over, but this victory mattered. The corrupt officers had been removed, and deeper investigations were underway to expose those higher up who had enabled the wrongdoing. Change wasn't coming easy, but it was coming, and that was a start. The community, once filled with doubt and frustration, now stood united. People who had long been silenced found their voices again, speaking up about their own experiences and pushing for lasting reform. The energy had shifted from hopelessness to determination. The woman, strong as ever, reflected on the journey. She hadn't sought out this fight, but life had a way of placing people where they needed to be. Her son had proven himself not just as a leader, but as someone who understood the importance of justice, even when it was personal. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, she looked over at him. "You did good," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "We did good." They both knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but they were ready. The woman's story had become a turning point, not just for her family, but for the entire community. People now believed that change was possible when accountability and courage worked hand in hand. The precinct itself began to transform under the chief's leadership. New training programs were implemented, transparency became a top priority, and the culture shifted toward one of service and respect. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was better, and that was enough for now. As the sun set on that chapter of their lives, the woman and her son sat in quiet peace, knowing they had done their part to spark something bigger than themselves. Justice, respect, and courage had found their way back into a system that had nearly forgotten them. And the woman, who once stood alone in the face of cruelty, now stood as a symbol of strength and resilience. This was not just the end of a story, it was the beginning of a legacy that would endure. The woman, meanwhile, carried her pain with quiet dignity. She didn't want to be seen as a victim, but she also knew this wasn't just about her. This was about making sure no one else had to experience what she did. And with her son now in a position to make real change, she knew the stakes were higher than ever. But the question lingered. Would justice truly be served? Or would the system find a way to protect its own once again? Stay tuned as this story unfolds, with twists you won't see coming. The day of the internal investigation arrived, and tensions ran high at the precinct. Officers moved about cautiously, their usual banter replaced by hushed conversations and nervous glances. The chief walked in, his face unreadable, every step calculated and firm. This wasn't just about policy or procedures, it was about justice, accountability, and his own integrity as a leader. The officers involved had been called in for questioning. They sat across from the chief and the investigative panel, their confident expressions slowly fading under the weight of the questions. Details of the traffic stop were reviewed, and body camera footage played back in excruciating detail. The room was silent, save for the sound of muffled voices from the recording, and the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The woman's son listened intently, his jaw clenched. Every second of that footage stung, but he kept his composure. This wasn't just about anger. It was about doing what was right, even when it was hard. Outside the station, the community had gathered. People held signs calling for justice, their voices rising in solidarity. This was bigger than one family's fight. It was a moment for change. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, waiting to see how the chief would handle a case that tested not only his leadership, but his values. The woman, standing quietly among the crowd, watched it all unfold. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for accountability. Her son had promised to be a leader who stood for justice, and she believed in him. But could the system really change? Could those who had long operated with impunity finally face the consequences of their actions? Inside, the questioning had reached a boiling point. One of the officers shifted uneasily in his seat, sweat beading on his forehead. The realization was dawning on them. They weren't walking away from this unscathed. The chief's voice remained calm but firm as he delivered the final round of questions, pushing them toward a breaking point. As the investigation reached its peak, everyone in that room, and outside, waited to see what would happen next. Would justice prevail, or would the weight of corruption prove too heavy to lift? Stay with me as we approach the moment that changes everything. Just when it seemed like the investigation had reached its breaking point, a sudden revelation turned everything upside down. One of the senior investigators walked into the room, holding a folder with a grim expression. The chief's eyes narrowed as he took the file, flipping through the pages with growing disbelief. What he read was enough to send a chill down his spine. This wasn't just about a single incident. The officers involved had a long history of complaints buried deep in the system, complaints that had mysteriously gone unanswered. Patterns of misconduct, intimidation, and abuse quietly swept under the rug. It was no accident that they felt untouchable. Someone had been protecting them. The chief's heart raced as he connected the dots. This wasn't just a failure of a few bad officers. It was a failure of the entire system he had sworn to lead. And now the spotlight wasn't just on those officers. It was on the leadership that had enabled them. Meanwhile, outside the station, the crowd grew restless. Rumors spread quickly, fueling a tense energy among the people demanding justice. The woman stood firm, her eyes scanning the scene as more community members arrived. She had always believed in accountability, but this was starting to feel like a fight much bigger than she had imagined. Back inside, the chief faced a decision that could define his entire career. He could quietly handle the situation, sweeping the larger issues under the rug to maintain order. Or he could expose the corruption, risking backlash not just from within the precinct, but from powerful figures who thrived in the shadows. The officers in question squirmed in their seats, sensing that the ground beneath them was crumbling. They had underestimated the chief, thinking his personal ties would cloud his judgment, but they were beginning to realize they had made a grave mistake. The stakes had never been higher. Would the chief have the courage to take on a system that had protected its own for far too long? And who, if anyone, would stand by him when the truth came out? Stay with me as this story takes an unexpected turn toward the moment of reckoning. Imagine a woman driving home after a long day, thinking nothing of the routine traffic stop that's about to change her life. The flashing lights in the rearview mirror signal her to pull over, and she does so without question. But what should have been a simple interaction takes a disturbing turn. The officers who approach her aren't interested in protocol or respect. They act with cruelty, fueled by prejudice. They don't ask her many questions, they just assume. And their assumptions are dangerous. This woman, strong and dignified, tries to remain calm despite the escalating aggression. But what happens next crosses every line imaginable. One of the officers extinguishes a cigarette on her arm. Yes, you heard that right. Pain, shock, and disbelief flash across her face. But here's what they didn't know. She isn't just any woman. She's the mother of someone powerful, someone who's about to shake up the very system these officers believe they control. Her son, the newly appointed police chief, a man determined to clean up corruption and restore justice. And now, justice is knocking at the asterisk door. Stay with me as I break down this jaw-dropping story of resilience, accountability, and the unexpected ways life has a funny way of evening the score. What happens when these officers learn the truth? What will her son, the new chief, do in response? You won't want to miss a second of it. Let's dive in. The story starts long before that night. This woman had always believed in fairness and justice, values she had passed down to her son. She taught him to respect the badge but never fear it, to believe that law enforcement existed to protect, not harm. But life has a way of challenging those beliefs, doesn't it? And nothing challenges them quite like seeing the ugly side of power up close. She wasn't looking for trouble that night. She was just trying to get home. But the officers? They seemed to have a different agenda. Maybe it was her confidence that rubbed them the wrong way, or maybe it was something else entirely, something as simple as prejudice that had festered unchecked for far too long. They spoke to her like she didn't matter, like she wasn't someone with a story, a family, a past, and a future. But little did they know, she was more than just the woman they chose to intimidate. Her story was about to intersect with theirs in a way they never expected. As the encounter escalated, she stayed composed. Years of strength carried her through, even when their actions crossed a line. But what do you do when you're faced with injustice? Do you shrink back, hoping it will go away? Or do you stand tall, knowing that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's been wronged? And here's the twist. Her son was watching the very system that raised him. He knew the badge could be a symbol of honor, but he had also seen it twisted into a weapon of fear. That's why he had taken on the role of chief, to be the change he wanted to see. But now it was personal. What would he do when he found out what had happened to his mother? And what about the officers? Did they even realize the storm they had just unleashed? Stay with me as this story takes a turn that no one saw coming. Back at the precinct, things were moving fast. Whispers spread among the ranks as word got around about the new chief, young, determined, and unafraid to clean house. Some officers were wary, others outright hostile to the idea of change. But none of them expected his very first challenge to hit so close to home. The officers involved in that traffic stop had no clue about the chain of events they had set in motion. To them, it was just another night. They carried on as usual, thinking they were untouchable. But there's always a reckoning, isn't there? Sometimes it comes quietly. Other times, it roars in like a storm you never saw coming. The woman's son sat in his office, staring at the complaint his mother had hesitantly filed. His heart pounded as he read every detail, each word cutting deeper than the last. He knew these types of stories all too well, but it was different when the victim was someone you loved. It wasn't just a case on his desk, it was personal. Meanwhile, the community was already talking. News travels fast in small circles, and people were outraged. For years, they had seen abuse of power go unchecked. But this was something else entirely. They wanted answers, and they wanted justice. On the other side of town, the officers involved were starting to feel the heat. One of them had a nagging feeling in his gut, a sense that something wasn't right. He hadn't realized who the woman was that night, but now pieces were falling into place. There was a nervous energy in the air, a sense that the ground beneath them was shifting.